people to keep a kind of collaboration. So one scary thing that I would like to share to all of you is that my mom would occasionally send me reports or newspaper about Women Initiative. So she is like a pro-China nationalist, the super scary kind. 小粉红那种，蓝丝那种. So he would talk so many bad things about black people, saying that, oh, you know, the black people that are coming to China and they're marrying our Chinese women and producing mixed blood babies or something. And I was like, wow, this is racist. So I don't see like there is some kind of friendly relationship that happens in China towards Africa. And that is something that I feel so sorry about in this Women Initiative. And this is the thing that I think is most dangerous in this project.
Other questions? I know it's 4 for you, but I have a question.
The question maybe had regard to the questions your questions reminds me of Sheridan actually quoted one of Zambia official described the certainty, saying that now Chinese is coming with their infrastructure construction, with their all the impact and influence. But we don't know. They come just like a flood, and we don't know what we will suffer or gain. But we know that someday this flood will recede. But then we hope that after the flood, the some deposit can make us just like enrich us for a better stage development. Yeah. So that's a quite interesting example. Also the question is that I also find that, for example, like Nairobi, Mombasa railway, and Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Tanzania, Zambia. All these railway Chinese help African to construct it, help or contracted for that, are on the old basis of the colonial train railway. And for example, like I have been traveling from Kampala to Nairobi and Mombasa, and then on that part, Nairobi to Mombasa, that train. But of course, it's so difficult. 12-hour bus or something like that. It's very difficult, and you just don't understand it. At the British colonial era, they have train from Kampala to Indian Ocean. But then after maybe just one or 2 years, maybe 1 year after their independence, it is ruined or abolished. The same goes to the French, Ethiopia to Djibouti, the same thing. So I just wonder how that kind of colonial relationship broke up. It must be broke up in a very cold or bitter situation, so that the colonial, the British or the French just leave it and never try to help to maintain that very important things. So they abolished it in 1 year, and then there were some objections on China's, for example, they after they delivered the railway, they have 5 years contract to run it, and the objection toward that is very mean. But I understand that it is at least need 5 years, of a Chinese operation to build up a hope which did not exist before. of passenger operation. Passenger operation. Now you see the African women girls in uniform, and they do those service. You see how this system, they learn how to operate this system. 5 years is at least. So compared to that, I just don't wonder why, that kind of construction have been just, and there's no intention to help those colonies to operating, to keep that.
Why?
I didn't study this.
The reason why is because colonization was not interested in development, it was interested in exploitation and extraction. So once the British left Kenya, once the British left Kenya, then they had no interest. When they were in control of Kenya and up into Uganda, they had an interest in maintaining the railway. But when Kenya becomes independent, it becomes Kenya's responsibility, and the ability of the British to draw the profit and extract from that railway disappears, so they go. They're not interested. There was also policy decisions made by post-independence governments to nationalise the railways, to take over control of the railways, and maintenance of African railways historically has been a problem. If you think about the Tanzan Railway, which was finished in 73, 74, 75, it's been rescued by the Chinese 2 or 3 times now. And they're currently doing the latest iteration of the rescue package. So that's always been a historical problem. The last question you asked is very interesting and very sensitive, isn't it? Which is the question of Chinese racism towards Africans. And that's something which I'm not an expert on. But I do know that certainly African friends and African people I know who've come to study in China, they have experienced, not all of them, but some of them have experienced discrimination. There's quite a good book called The Discourse on Race, Modern China by Frank Dicotter, which okay. Who talks about these sensitive issues of racial hierarchies in Chinese thinking towards white people, towards Indian people, towards African people, and there's a kind of hierarchy. And the black people are not very high up in this hierarchy, I should say. But this is not an area I've studied. Although I did actually study there was a very interesting. Do you remember in 1988 there was big anti-African riots in Nanjing? Does anyone remember that? Yeah.
University.
At the university.
Not public.
Yeah. And that kind of was one of the first times, public times, that people could see that the relationship was not as smooth as had been portrayed. But I think that was provoked by behaviour on both sides, as far as I remember. So, but it's a very sensitive question. With regards to the infrastructure, I do agree that they provide an opportunity. I do think that they do provide opportunities for development. But I do think that the opportunities are still constrained by the system, the global system. But certainly, Africa has a huge infrastructure gap, which is needed to be filled. Roads, railways. You go to some countries, the roads are terrible, the railways don't function, etc. So when the Chinese deliver on these projects, that is a positive. I think I've said that before. It provides an opportunity. The question then becomes, what do the local African governments do with this new infrastructure, these new opportunities? And with regards to China and responsibility, I personally don't think it's China's responsibility to develop Africa. Obviously, I think China, all foreign external actors in Africa should try to avoid doing damage or harm, but ultimately, African governments, within their structural constraints, need to negotiate with whoever, Chinese, the French, the British, it doesn't matter, the best deal that they can. And in that sense, then we'll see different outcomes in different countries. Because in some countries you have capable governments who are able to think through the long-term effects of Chinese investment or French investment or whatever. And in other governments, other countries, you have governments which lack capacity. You mentioned the Zambian, we hope that there'll be some benefit. I mean, that kind of raises questions about the Zambian government, that they hope, hoping for something is not the same as having a policy which will try to develop or try to extract, and across the continent, the capacity of different governments is very diverse, and in some countries, I have to say, the capacity of some governments in Africa is very, very poor, and that's where I think we get these abuses and exploitation, because the governments are not controlling what's going on.
If I could just add.
If I could just add a little bit to the question of people-to-people relations, which touches on the question of race. This is an interesting issue because race is like one of these terms in discourse that's done academically and politically in our China-Africa relations, which is similar to this other term, empire. A colleague of mine, Ming-Wei Huang, basically called these kinds of terms disavowed disciplinary objects. And what she meant by that is the way a discourse forms, there's certain terms that everyone knows is the limit. It's like we don't talk about those terms because it's a sensitive issue, right? So empire is sensitive for reasons of Chinese national identity as being anti-imperial, regardless of, and the empire didn't come up today, which is interesting. We can maybe go back to that. But race is another one. And I think with race, the discussion of race in China-Africa relations has a major problem. And on the one side, we have people like Decatur, who take the position of arguing that China has racism too. I mean, that's a simplification, right? He has a much more complex argument. But there's a kind of argument which always wants to point out, look, there's racism of Chinese towards Africans. And oftentimes it's Europeans or Americans recognizing anti-black stereotypes. On the other hand, there's a counter discourse, which is equally problematic, which tries to argue that race has nothing to do with China because China's unique history, or that China doesn't have racism, or that China had male zhongzi, no race, 有民族, right? And so it's like, so it's an interesting issue here, and there are some scholars in the China-Africa field who argue very, very strongly that race doesn't apply. So there's a scholar, Yuan-horng, for example, who's Barry Saltman, and they very much object to this, and they make very elaborate arguments. We can talk about the arguments themselves about why race is not a factor. And I think it is, but I think it's more complicated, and I think it's probably translation. So I want to ask you, when you're having a conversation with your mother, the kind of language is being used. How did you translate race? Did you say zhongzu? What did you say to your mother?
Okay, first of all, I have to say that I think my case is a little bit different because I'm from Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong has been colonized, and so we have like a very mixed kind of historical trajectory. So it is possible that you can say that there is racism in Hong Kong. I mean, maybe there's no racism in China, I don't know, but there's racism in Hong Kong for sure. We are being colonized, and we are quite separatist. A lot of people are quite separatist. So I was talking to my mom saying that it's to racism, basically. I think she understands that. And I think that term is valid in Hong Kong, and we are in that world.
And Singapore too, and so Singapore will have zhongzu, but in China the problem is zhongzu it hasn't been an official category since '49. I think in Taiwan the textbooks still say that there's 5 races, right? Because Sun Yat-sen said there were 5 races, right? The Bai, Pei, in the old textbooks in Taiwan, it includes Sun Yat-sen talking about how there was this.
Oh no, Sun Yat-sen's 5 is Han,
Yeah.
Han, Manchu, Mongolian, Uyghur, Tibetan.
And the point is, like, earlier on they were using the word zhongzu, but then eventually China doesn't have zhongzu, it has minzu, and there's a definition of it. But I think the broader question is this issue of reading race in China and how to translate it's very difficult. And so when it comes to the I think it's in the case of people complaining about African men, and we gotta think about the gender element of this as well. African men coming to China and having intimate relations with Chinese women, that's often been a point of tension and motivation among sort of the Chinese right, if we can call them that. But in everyday relations among Chinese migrants and Africans in Africa, it becomes more complicated. And I think I went into the field, because I did still work in Tanzania. I lived with Chinese for a year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And I would hear people say things that I would think, that's racist. But a lot of it came from my recognition, which comes, it's a weird thing about being an American. I read a lot into it, so I had to kind of reflect. But I think one of the big issues with the issue of race in these relations is there's an assumption that racism in China is a product of the West, or Hollywood movies, or it's simply, and so people like Lian Shan, who's a major African studies scholar in Beijing, argued that the more Chinese and Africans would interact with each other, the knowledge would break away ignorance. So that's the idea that ignorance. But the problem is that having seen actual interactions that are between Chinese who meet Tanzanians for the first time, those interactions can become quite tense because of language barriers, because of bosses and employees. There's that class contradiction which gets racialized. Chinese are often targeted by Tanzanian officials. So this idea that the Chinese have cash, and so there's always these officials will come in to find Zhao Mafan, like, oh, your tire, your car is the wrong registration, buy me water. And so there's a sort of resentment among Chinese migrants, and they say, these, and they start to use words, Heyren, and then they look to me like, oh, Heyren in the U.S. And so there's a way in which there's this way in which interactions on the ground get kind of compared to these globally circulating discourses, kind of produce a reproduction of racial relations, but not always. It depends on the situation, I think. And I think this goes back to the issue of gratitude as well, because you sort of see gratitude and this idea of sort of having a future. I think it happens now, is that when these things happen on the street, when Chinese feel targeted by thieves, or by police officers, they'll say, oh, look, China has given so much, and look, they have Meo Ganen, they don't have any gratitude. But it's an interesting question of how do we measure, because they didn't personally build Tazara. And so it becomes this kind of issue of how you perceive gratitude and ingratitude. So I think this goes back to the question of how these people relations, they can be mutually beneficial and lead to good feelings and friendship, but they can also lead to tensions that relate to perceptions of who has given, who is deserving, and expectations. So it's a good question to bring up the people-to-people aspect, because I think it's very complicated on the ground. And I don't want to say on the ground because states don't just fly in the air, they're on the ground too. So we got everyday relationships, because there's off-stage and on-stage discourse too. So, anyway.
That's very important perspective you mentioned, people to people. That's true, because we have too much structural nation state, this kind of political economy. So on this business issue, it's too easy to be a logo or what is called branding. Is that you are labeled as a racist. Sometimes you look at someone, doesn't mean you are racist. For example, in Cantonese, they still call you West people devil. They still call you devil, white devil. And also we call the small Japanese, small Japanese. It doesn't mean we are racist against. It's just the historical antagonism and all this, a lot of other feelings. But then you are racist. You understand? So this term racist can be placed on you in any occasions.
And I just have to quickly read. I agree with that, but I also think it's a dynamic process. And so for example, when Chinese and Tanzania are complaining about security and worrying about don't let Heyren or black people into the compound, that discourse is similar to what they might say about migrants in Guangzhou. And so from their trajectory, it's not racist. But what they're saying is similar to what Indians, who they're living with maybe, in Tanzania are saying. And from the Indian perspective, it is racist because of the history of British colonization. So I think it becomes racist not because of the intention, but because of the larger global context. And that's one of the problems with trying to cordon off Chinese discourse saying, well, it's not racist because it's not, because the history is different. It may be true, but globally, it's unfortunately complicit, even passively, with a global racist discourse, which is already there. in which these things can have a larger result. I mean, it's a question of who has the right to label who were raised. That's a whole other question.
Just to add to that, so when I lived in Hong Kong, there was a debate as to whether the use of the word guilo was acceptable. Yeah, or even hakwai was acceptable.
It's very bad.
Yeah.
Black Devil.
Black Devil. So it never got resolved because on the one hand you had the Chinese people saying, no, it's not offensive, it's a term of endearment, you know, white devil, okay? And then you had, it's basically British people saying, some people say, oh, I think it's funny and we don't really care, and then others will say, oh, it is racist, you shouldn't use it. It never got resolved, so.
And the thing with Black Devil, like that term itself, is yes, it's, you know, it's a local usage, but what explains when I have conversations with Chinese friends, they say, oh, this term is the same as your English, I'm not going to say the word, the N word, right? And so they're finding equivalencies. That's what I mean by you can't sort of separate this culture's language discourse about race than this one, because people find these equivalencies. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize, is people make equivalences, and that's problematic.
In a Cantonese restaurant in Denmark, they use some waitress, Danish waitress, they call it Gui Mei. They call them Gui Mei, but they are good friends. They're even dating sometimes, but they call it Gui Mei. So it's very...
Sorry, because it is not really direct, connected to today's subject.
No.
My master thesis is about cross-border marriages between the Taiwanese and the Africans, male like female. So I try to challenge the upward mobility, marrying up. Usually, students from Africa coming to Asia, they belong to somehow good family economically. And then for Africans coming to Asia, it is not upward mobility, because the dream is going to US, going to Europe. So coming already to Asia is not big things. So there is somehow a both side confusion, because you know very well the situation of Chinese in Africa. They are also discriminated, because the Africans do not think that Chinese are higher than them. We somehow, all of us agree that the Europeans are up, but not the Chinese. So we'll see when we are in the world, they suffer also discrimination. That's why for my research, for my master thesis now, I don't want to touch this subject because we are looking at it on one side, Chinese side. But once we move, even when we take the plane to reach in Africa, from Kenya already, usually I have always speak to the people from the customer, because we want to make those Chinese pay a lot. I always stand up against what they are doing because of the language barrier, English, French. So they try to cheat them, because for them, they don't consider the Chinese like being high. This is real. This is something that's going on in Africa. But those living here, they don't know the situation there. The people in Africa, they also don't know that there is a discrimination in China. But now recently, with the discrimination in India, it's coming out because of the internet. So this is also my big worry about the China-Africa relation. If these things start going out because of the internet, there might be a backlash about this relation.
I noticed on the post it says 5:30. Is that true, or are we actually 5? So technically speaking, we would need to stop now. But is there? I mean, people. If I ask for no questions, some people say, "No, I want to leave." Does anyone have like a pressing question? I just want everyone maybe first thank our translator for their hard work. Thank our speakers for the great presentations, and thank everyone for the discussion.
I propose we should thank
And thank
who collect us together.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.